Thank you so much, Sander, and thanks everyone for being here today. I will share my screen slowly so you have a little bit of time to get captions up and running for us here. Hopefully you all can see this PowerPoint screen now. So as Sander said, my name is Kendall DeLyser. I am the Director of Climate Science at American Forests. I'm really glad to be co-presenting with Chad Papa from Michigan State today. Also want to shout out that we have Ken Davidson, another member of our modeling team on the line. He's leading a lot of our kind of upcoming work for Oregon. So we're here to talk today about some work that we've been doing modeling forest management and wood use across 7 states in the US. And Chad and I have actually been working on this since 2019 or 2020. So this has been a long-running project, part of a collaborative team that I lead at American Forests, obviously with deep partnership with Michigan State University. We have partners at the US Forest Service, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and also the Canadian Forest Service, and some really key partners. We're using a model originally developed by the Canadian Forest Service team, so their partnership has really been invaluable. We have done this work, as I said, for 7 different states, and we have partners in those states, meaning that we're working with the natural resource agencies in each one of those. So we've done some work with Maryland and Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Oregon, and California. So we've worked with CAL FIRE, for example, in California, which really helps make sure that the results of our research are ready to be applied, they're ready to be used in decision-making for the forest. So essentially what we do in these projects is a giant scenario comparison. We're modeling the carbon impacts of different forest management, wood utilization, and natural disturbance scenarios, as Chad will talk about a little bit more. The important thing to note here is that we take a whole sector approach to this. So we're looking at the carbon that's not just in the forested ecosystem, but also the carbon in wood products. We're looking at the substitution benefits from using those wood products in place of other things in the economy. We can look at potential leakage effects. We have economics in parentheses here because the team that I manage doesn't have an economist on it, but economics and financial considerations we know are really, really key to these resource management decisions. And so we'll see, we've had a couple kind of sister projects, one for some work in the Mid-Atlantic you'll see a little bit about, and CAL FIRE has also done an associated economic analysis based on our results so that we can really kind of paint that whole picture for our decision makers. As we run these models, essentially we get a number that helps us understand the climate mitigation potential of each of the scenarios that we've run and the practices that they represent across the landscape. And that helps us identify climate smart forestry practices for each state. Then this is where we kick in with our state partners to help them integrate resilience or carbon into forest management and planning efforts, both at their the kind of state land scale, but also thinking about their partnerships with federal lands, thinking about programs with private landowners. And then we can work at the state policy level to think about integrating forests as natural climate solutions in state climate planning and funding. And here's where I need to acknowledge the US Climate Alliance. All 7 of the states we've been working with are Climate Alliance members, so they're very committed to moving forward a lot of critical climate action at the state level. So when we talk about climate smart forestry, if I say we're identifying those kinds of practices, just to level set what we're talking about here, we're looking for a set of practices that aim to balance and sustain the ability of forests to adapt to climate change, to mitigate climate change, and to provide essential co-benefits, things like wood products or clean water or wildlife habitat. And this really, I think, invokes the stewardship ethic that Xander was talking about in his introduction. We want to help respond to the most pressing forest issues that forests across the country are facing. And of course, in each of the states and regions that we've modeled, those pressing issues are very different. But ultimately, we want to be good stewards of the forest and help to create healthy and resilient future forests across the landscape. Chad, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kendall. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach, and then we'll highlight some results as well. So for this project, we're using the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector, the CBM CSF3. So this is an operational scale model. And so one of the reasons we highlighted this model is because it allows us a lot of kind of power in both our forward-looking projections at like a landscape scale. So we're modeling everything at like the state scale, so using those boundaries, but also specifically that the outputs of the ecosystem side of this model can directly feed into an ANSI framework for harvested wood product, which helps facilitate the tracking of carbon in the forest product sector. Some things to kind of just note about that is the version of the model that we're using is spatially referenced. And so this isn't like a pixel-based model or any type of other like dynamic vegetation global model. We can use some level of like classifiers to denote specific locations within our forest inventory, but just know that this isn't a type of model that's like tracking carbon across like pixels or like a map. And then generally kind of how the CBM works is we have some empirically derived inputs. So everything from forest inventory data, harvest schedules, information around disturbance, and that's inputted into the model. And then there are process-based equations and elements within the model that help us simulate transfers of carbon between both carbon pools in the forest as well as the atmosphere as well. So go to the next slide, Kendall. So when it comes to actually using this, so Kendall highlighted this a little bit, and so kind of the main overarching purpose of this project is this idea of a scenario analysis. So to do something like that, we first need to develop what we calling our business as usual simulation or scenario. And this is more or less a projection of kind of our like some longer term trends or best estimates into the future related to forest management and wood utilization. And so to do that, we need a variety of different inputs. So just to highlight some things, we use a lot of forest inventory analysis data produced by the USDA Forest Service, which is a national scale forest inventory product to estimate everything from our forest inventory. So how much forest land do we have? What are the characteristics? What types of forests? Maybe how old are those forests? We also use that data to estimate growth yield relationships or growth yield curves. So these are age volume curves that we can use to predict productivity of that forest land. We also have some volume to biomass conversions. So for those of you that have some carbon science backgrounds, knowing that the volume of timber in a forest stand is pretty correlated to the amount of carbon. And so we're able to actually take those volume estimates and convert them into live biomass as well as dead biomass. And then we have a mixture of different data products we use to both highlight management practices such as harvesting, prescribed fires, as well as other things like natural disturbances, so disease, insect outbreaks, as well as like land use change, so the conversion of forest land to non-forest land, as well as the conversion of non-forest land, like an abandoned agricultural field, to forest land. So all of these are incorporated into kind of our like landscape scale ecosystem model. We're able then to project that into the future, making a variety of different assumptions. So then on top of that, we did a lot of like participatory engagement with our state partners to kind of both highlight and identify what are some of the priorities and concerns to forest land in their states. And then we take that information and translate that narrative into a quantifiable number. So this could be things around concerns for future regeneration of stands following harvest. Maybe this is thinking about increasing the amount of land that we're planting, or maybe it's decreasing the amount of deforestation. So we're able to take that information, change it into a quantifiable number, parameterize it, and then also simulate that into the future. And then we can think about what is that kind of net difference between the alternate management or alternate state from our business as usual simulation. And then again, we have our kind of like ancillary harvested wood product models as well. So we're able to take the outputs of that ecosystem side model and directly input them into our framework to track carbon throughout the forest product. So that's tracking everything from like recycling rates to half-lives of different products, exports, and then we're able to combine those two estimates to get a sector-wide picture of what are carbon dynamics looking like in our study area. So next slide.
Okay, so as Chad mentioned, we did a lot of kind of participatory work with our state partners and other experts to come up with a list of scenarios to model in each of our regions. So here you can see, we did this analysis on a state level, but a lot of our states are next to each other. We can think about these as kind of regional scenarios. One thing I want you to notice about this list is that it's really long. So a lot of other natural climate solutions analyses tend to, or thinking about carbon offset markets, they tend to look at a kind of limited set of practices. You can plant trees, you can protect trees, or you can wait to cut them. We do have scenarios that look at that, but we also have a lot of scenarios that reflect the kind of pressing concerns or the priorities that our state partners identified for forests in each place. So we do have some similar scenarios or kind of common themes for each region, such as afforestation or changes in rotation length, reducing deforestation. We also have regions or practices, rather, like thinning and prescribed fire that we modeled as timber stand improvements for the Mid-Atlantic, but we've actually modeled as fire resilience treatments for the Pacific coast. So there are a lot of things that we can look at here, a lot of key differences between the regions, but it's also really interesting to see how some of the same practices can be done for very different reasons, depending on the drivers or the objectives of those practices. So we are now going to talk through a couple snapshots of results from various states. I'll hand it over to Chad to talk about some of our work for the Eastern US first.
Yeah, so I'm just going to highlight like one example and from some of our Mid-Atlantic work. We have 2 reports out that we published. We have a peer-reviewed publication. And so this was the first area that we focused in on. So for those of you that are interested, that maybe are more familiar with the Eastern US, we have a lot of like mixed hardwood dominated forests. And there's a lot of like concerns around future regeneration and restocking of those forests. Thinking that a lot of these forests are secondary regrowth after a little bit more of like an exploitation model of timber management, and then maybe some agricultural land abandonment. We have issues around really heavy like herbivory browse that can impact the future trajectory of those stands. A lot of highly degraded stands as well. So like, for example, in a lot of these hardwood stands, you get some very unsustainable diameter limit cuts or like high grading, where you're removing a lot of the maybe best of the trees that could be used to help naturally regenerate that hardwood stand afterwards, which then can lead to kind of a future degraded state or understocked state of that stand, and also leading to diminished growth. And we can think about that has ramifications for the carbon cycle, right? Forests are a dynamic system. Above ground biomass or above ground carbon is very like predictable from kind of the dynamics of the trees in that stand. And so thinking about how does this management kind of intersect and what does that actually mean for the carbon implications, a very important ecosystem function that kind of supports a lot of the other benefits that we receive from forests. And so this was a kind of question that we identified within our conversations with our state partners in the Mid-Atlantic. So next slide. So here's some results. And so you can see this is a graphic showing all of our simulations over time for the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to highlight both our kind of our reduced diameter limit cuts or reduction in high grading, as well as some of our treatments to kind of both control deer browse pressures as well as restock. So you can see in our results, we all kind of have this trend of we start as a net carbon sink, starting the model in 2007. We have our projection point of 2020, so we use historic data to parameterize the model and started a little earlier, ran that up to 2020, and then we use these longer term averages to project that into the future. You can see quite quickly in this that we actually switch from being a forest carbon sink to a forest carbon source. So we're now emitting more carbon to the atmosphere than we are taking in. This kind of happens around years 2030 to 2040. Just a little like addition to that is understanding what's driving that. So there's things like the amount of timber that we're removing from the ecosystem, which is one, just a reduction in carbon, as well as minimizing the amount of maybe future potential growth that we see. We see also kind of a drawback as well in productivity as our forests age. So a lot of forests in this area are kind of like middle age, so like reaching maturity, which is oftentimes a very high point of growth in the trajectory of that stand. So we also see kind of a tapering off of that productivity. And then we also see some increases in ecosystem level respiration, right? So as our forests are aging, we have a lot more like down dead woody debris, which can also increase emissions in our system. So if we progress, so I'm going to highlight these specific scenarios. You can see on here we have represented our business as usual, our restocking, controlled deer browse, and reduced diameter limit cuts. And we can see enacting some of these different alternative management practices, what they can do to the trajectory of our future carbon. So just to highlight one on here, so we have our portfolio simulation, which is kind of a suite of different management practices all thrown together. You can see that actually pushes off the point of when we switch from a sink to a source, the farthest from all of the other ones. There's a lot of, you can see stochasticity in some of those lines as well. So if you go to the next image as well, we can think about what are actually the cumulative effects over time, right? So we're thinking about this into the future. And so maybe also understanding what does this look like, not just annually as an annual value, but what does that mean when we think about summing those across time? And we can also think about that as like a net difference from our business as usual. But you can see that up until 2100, if we enact our portfolio scenario, we actually remain a net carbon sink over that entire time, even though we do have certain years that we actually emit more carbon than we sequester. And so this is kind of just highlighting kind of that interplay between some of these management practices and what that means for kind of this landscape level carbon dynamics. So if we go to the next slide. We can also think about splitting up some of our values as well. So this is showing some cumulative emissions that are standardized to our business as usual. So understanding this is the delta value between our business as usual simulation versus what the alternative management scenario either sequestered more or emitted more from that BAU. And so negative values here are simulations that sequestered more carbon than the business as usual. So again, we can highlight and look at what is that delta if we enact some of these practices now and understand maybe into the future what that means for our forest carbon sink. The red dots on there is the cumulative effect, and we have it broken up by different kind of categories. And so we can think about how is the forest ecosystem affected, but also how do these management practices affect emissions from harvested wood products? What does that mean for material or energy substitution? So using wood in place of a more emission intensive material. So like, for example, substituting a wood house versus a cinder block or brick house. We can also think about leakage as well. So we looked at a couple different values of leakage. So leakage is when you have a reduction in harvest in one spot, and then you have an increase in harvest somewhere else caused by that reduction. So for example, if we're harvesting less in Maryland, maybe we're harvesting a little bit more in Virginia, thinking that those mills might increase the basket that they're sourcing their timber from. So we did try to estimate that as well, understanding that some of our simulations decrease the amount of harvest removals and thinking about that there are some of these downstream effects from that. And what does that mean for kind of this net carbon balance or this total carbon budget that we're estimating at the state level? So if we go to the next slide, we can also then kind of like synthesize that and thinking about what practices did we see kind of the maximum benefit or the kind of that balancing of different benefits that we want from our system. So there's some very easy ones that are very intuitive, right? So like maintaining and increasing the amount of forest land that we have, the sustainability of those practices and the health of those working forests, these are climate solutions, right? So like a healthy forest, a working forest has climate mitigation benefits, and it also helps meet some other benefits that we receive from society. Thinking about how do we actually help protect the natural regeneration of our forests. And so again, this highlighting kind of like that controlled deer browse, those restocking simulations that we looked at, thinking about the sustainability of our timber supply as well, right? Wood is a renewable resource. It's a very valuable resource. And thinking about managing for forest health now gives us benefits down the road when it comes from a resource production standpoint. Then also thinking about how do we prepare for the negative impacts of climate change. There's lots of things we could do now that maybe actually reduce the amount of carbon in an ecosystem, but maybe it makes that ecosystem a little bit more resilient to any type of future stresses or disturbance later on. And so kind of just like our big takeaway from this study was enacting a pretty modest suite of activities at the state level can increase our carbon sink up to 29% in Maryland and 38% in Pennsylvania by 2030. And so a lot of these actions are already ongoing, and it's a lot of just maybe increasing some of those actions or being a little bit more concerted with those types of actions. So if we go to the next slide as well. So the last thing I'm going to highlight here is myself and then some other colleagues just submitted another paper recently looking at the results from the study I just talked about, but thinking about what are some of the financial trade-offs of that carbon management. So we calculated net present value using the results from those Maryland and Pennsylvania. And so that is kind of like the total sum of all revenue from forest activities, whether that's for timber or maybe enrolling your land in a carbon market, and subtracting the total cost. So everything from management costs, land rent, we use like a discount rate or an interest rate to account for inflation in the future. And we were able to actually look at a range of kind of carbon sensitivity prices to see how much carbon do we actually accrue on the amount of acres that we treated, and then what price of carbon gets us to a break-even point with timber production. So I'm just going to highlight, for example, in our like restocking scenario, we kind of estimated the additional like labor costs when it comes to planting trees. It would take around $50 per ton of CO2 equivalency to get you kind of back to the same amount of money that you might receive for just management for timber. And I think really one of the more important takeaways from this slide is both planting trees, so like afforestation, has a very low opportunity cost when it comes to comparing that to, like, to say, timber management, and then our portfolio scenario as well, where we enacted a lot of different types of managements. You can see that only around $20 per ton of CO2 equivalency was required to kind of get us back to the same level of like future financial return from timber management. Obviously, this is a little bit of a simplified example, right? Like people are managing, especially private forest land managers are managing for a lot of different services, a lot of different benefits, understanding that timber is one of those primary things. And so we were just kind of interested in looking at a range of enrollment of land into, like, let's say, a voluntary carbon payment program. What types of payments do we need to make that economically competitive versus maybe just a more traditional timber management approach? So that's what I have there. I'm going to hand it over to Kendall now, who's going to go through some of our other results.
Great, thanks, Chad. So we are going to switch gears to the other coast of the US now and talk about some of this work that I just finished for California. We just published that report online last week, and I have a little QR code at the end of this presentation so you can go and find it if you want to dig into what we've done. A big evolution of our modeling process across the 5.5 to 6 years we've been doing this has been incorporating projected climate change impacts into our model, especially in a state like California where climate change is already affecting the way that forests are growing. It's already affecting natural disturbances. We cannot project future carbon trajectories ignoring the potential changes from climate change. So we incorporated this into our model in 3 different ways. One was to modify those growth and yield curves that Chad mentioned before. That's our way to tell the model how much carbon accumulates in the forest over time. In California, in general, we're projected to see a decline in productivity into the future because of climate mismatch. Species are growing in non-optimal conditions, and so you see a decline in productivity from that. We also incorporated changes in natural disturbances, specifically increases in frequency and severity of wildfire, insect outbreaks, drought mortality, a continuation of trends that we've already seen in California over the last 10 or so years, if not longer. But things are projected to kind of intensify for the state, especially starting in the 2040s or 2050s. The final component that we worked on is this concept of post-fire regeneration failure. So this is quantifying the percent of forest area burned that could fail to regrow after a high severity wildfire. And there is a bit of a vicious cycle here. If we have projections of more and more severe wildfire areas, you're likely to have more and more areas of forest that are going to fail to regenerate afterwards. And you get into a kind of downward spiral that's very difficult to stop. I'll say all of these are under RCP 8.5, so this is a kind of high emissions trajectory. It's a somewhat extreme scenario, but I think becoming increasingly likely that these are at least some of the climate conditions we might be facing. So when we look at the impacts of this in California, a few things to point out. So the forest ecosystem in California is actually already a net carbon source, according to our models. Really made that transition in 2015. If you see this laser pointer here, there were a couple large-scale insect mortality events in 2015 and 2016, enabled by drought that happened a few years before that. And the number of trees that died from that kind of turned the forest ecosystem in California from a net carbon sink, meaning capturing carbon from the atmosphere, to a net carbon source, meaning that we're emitting more carbon to the atmosphere on net from forests. As you can see, both lines in this panel C here, this black dotted line is for our kind of null model, business as usual. This tan line is for our climate adjusted business as usual. So incorporating the three elements of projected climate change I just described, and assuming that management practices kind of stay the same. Both of these are above zero. Both of these are in carbon source territory for the rest of our simulation. So essentially, we're looking at a future with less forest carbon in it for California. It's not the name of the game to try to increase the net forest carbon sink so much as it is to minimize forest carbon emissions from the state and try to get things back to a healthier and more resilient future condition. A lot of this trend is driven by that cycle of high severity wildfire and post-fire regen failure. We found, summarizing from literature sources, that an average of 82% of forests in California could fail to regenerate after high severity wildfire into the future. And that drives a pretty significant loss of forest area and carbon over the 50 years of our projection period. Basically, you're losing 50%, just under 50% of your forest area, 50% of your carbon stocks for the state. And then you have a corresponding increase in carbon emissions overall from forests in these conditions. So because a lot of this is driven by wildfire, of course, we have to think about what resilience to wildfire might look like. And this is very true for California, but holds for a lot of Western forests, that they are currently more dense than their historic conditions. This enables more extreme wildfire behavior. So if you take this photo on the left here, you can see on the left side of the road, there's this stand that's considered treated. And by treated, we mean it's been subjected to some kind of thinning or prescribed fire or both. That's going to help control some of that understory vegetation. You can see there are larger trees in there. There's a little bit of space between them. Contrast that to the stand that's on the right side of the road. You can see a bunch of this understory vegetation. These are what we call ladder fuels. You can imagine a fire going up to the top of one of these small trees, getting up into the crown of the big tree. Once you have a crown fire, you're in a lot of trouble in terms of wildfire spread and severity. So if you can actually do some of these treatments across the landscape, they have demonstrated impacts in reducing tree mortality, reducing wildfire severity. This middle photo here is an example from the Bootleg Fire in Oregon. You can see the top here is an area that received no kind of treatment. It is essentially scorched earth at this point. The bottom third is an area that received a thinning treatment, but not a follow-up prescribed fire. Trees are still standing, but a lot of them look dead. If you have this kind of middle area where you had thinning and prescribed fire together, this is trying to mimic more the way the ecosystem would have evolved, with fewer fuels, with lower intensity fires, kind of maintaining that slightly more open canopy structure. So this combination of practices was documented to actually have helped the forest survive what was otherwise a very intense fire. So you've seen the reduction in tree mortality that comes with that. The post-fire regeneration failure also comes in. If you imagine this, kind of top third of this photo, the no treatment, it's going to look a lot like this photo on the right if you're on the ground. A lot of dead trees, not a seed source in sight. So a lot of the post-fire regeneration failure occurs because these areas are so big and so badly burned and so far from a living seed source that forests are not going to be able to come back there on their own. There's still a lot of nascent science around all of this. But increasingly, it seems like there is an increasing trend likely to occur for this post-fire regeneration failure. And when that occurs, we have to do everything we can, both to treat those areas afterwards. It's really important to go back and reforest them if you want them to be forest again, but also to try to enact some of these treatments on the ground to reduce fire severity and avoid the need for that reforestation in the first place. So because this is such a driver for California, we actually conducted our own landscape resilience needs assessment to understand what is the scale of the problem. And so we took this layer of wildfire hazard potential created by Pyrologics. And wildfire hazard potential is a metric that looks at both the likelihood of an area to burn and the likelihood of it to be catastrophic or get out of control if it does burn. So the areas on this map in orange and red, the high and very high wildfires hazard potential, are the areas that are, most likely to create the next megafire. They have to be the top priority for implementing some of these kind of resilience treatments. So we overlaid this with various geospatial data sets of forest type and ownership, things like wilderness areas, accessibility from roads, critical wildlife habitat, just to get a sense of what's at stake in these very kind of high need areas. We found that over 11 million acres of forest in California need restoration to reduce fire hazard. Now, California has 31.5 million acres of forest total. So this is over a third of the state is in this kind of mission critical state right now. If we think about fire resilience treatments, including thinning or prescribed fire or both, there are some places that are too far from a road or too steep, or they're protected. They're in a kind of wilderness area where active management isn't feasible or isn't allowed. So with those operational restrictions, we go from a pot of 11 million acres down to about 7.3 million acres that can actually feasibly be treated. So you're not treating everything, but there's a hope that if you are able to treat enough of the landscape, maybe you start to confer some resilience benefits to the surrounding areas that aren't getting that treatment. For our model, we modeled full treatment of these acres in need over a 10-year period. So this is an acknowledgement of the urgency of the need across the landscape, but this is a big scale up in terms of the current capacity and current treatment rates occurring within California. There are policy efforts and efforts within the governor's task force to try to ramp up the amount of treatment, but this is still calling for a big step up in that implementation. So keep in mind that even if we accomplish this, it's going to require a lot of additional capacity. If we do accomplish this, though, we have a much better carbon trajectory for California. So if our treatments are successful and we're able to treat the entire landscape, we are going to decrease the projected forest area loss, especially from post-fire regeneration failure. You see in this top panel here, instead of the black dashed line for our CBAU scenario, we can be anywhere up in here. So we're still losing a little bit of forest, but in the best portfolio that we put together, you're only losing about 8% instead of 48%. Correspondingly, you have more ecosystem carbon stocks that stick around because you have more area that is forested, you have more trees that are growing. Of course, the trade-off with this is that we have to incur an upfront carbon loss relative to if we did nothing in order to get this carbon stability into the future. So that's represented by this yellow bracket here. In this first 10-year period where we modeled a bunch of treatments, you can see for some of these resilience scenarios, there's a lot more carbon that's coming out of the landscape or more emissions. This makes sense, right? We're using a lot more prescribed fire. We are thinning more material. A lot of that material, though, is kind of small diameter stuff. It's stuff that would normally go into the pulp and paper supply chain. California has no pulp and paper market. It used to exist. It was not financially feasible, so it's gone. Currently, all of that material that might be suitable for pulp and paper use is piled on site. Maybe it gets burned in follow-up. It will sit and decay, or maybe it creates a fuel bed that fuels the next large wildfire. So this is a problem, right? If you're doing the treatments, but you can't actually remove the fuel from the landscape, you're kind of leaving carbon on the table. So actually being able to use that material, putting it into new uses such as transportation fuels or biochar or mass timber where you can, that's really critical to maximizing the climate mitigation benefits of these treatments. In order to do that, though, you can imagine all of this material that's coming off 7.3 million acres. The wood processing capacity in California can't keep up right now. Based on CAL FIRE's economic analysis that we did, the wood processing capacity needs to basically double in order to make use of this material. That includes both sawmills and bioenergy facilities. So we're talking about, or biomass facilities, we're talking about a large increase in the capacity to use this material that's needed. And you have to think about where to put those across the landscape, because there's a pretty short distance where you can drive before it costs you more money to take all of that material out. Even if wood product prices are good, if the markets are strong, the revenues from the products you might get out from this are not going to fully cover the treatments. So very relevant for our partners in California, for CAL FIRE and others who are actually thinking about natural climate solutions, investments and goals right now. There's going to need to be investment in these really, really critical treatments that comes from elsewhere. The treatments are not going to pay for themselves. And there's a limited window of time in which we actually have to do them. If you look at this graph here, this black dotted line again is our kind of CBAU. This is just letting climate change do what it's going to do. We have about this window of time until 2035, the 2040s, where climate change impacts are projected to ramp up. If we can get these treatments out on the ground before that happens, we will have a much more resilient future. If we can't, we're going to be kind of fighting against headwinds in this case. So if we think about what climate smart forestry looks like for California, this is going to be very different in some ways than what we listed for the Mid-Atlantic before. I know I've focused a lot on wildfire because it is really the biggest driver of things across the state for California. We did also run scenarios looking at forest conservation, looking at extended rotations, looking at silvopasture. If you combine those three things with those resilience treatments that we need, the thinning and prescribed fire that can help us reduce fire severity, and landscape restoration, thinking about that post-fire restoration and reforestation work. If you combine all of those, that becomes this kind of max NCS action portfolio. And we should note max NCS action here means all of the natural climate solutions practices we modeled. There are more things you can do with forests and more things you can do in California that are not included in this model. But if you do that and you add the innovative wood utilization component, you're not leaving that small diameter stuff on site, but you're actually taking it out and you're using it. These are by far the most compelling scenarios, the best way to reduce forest carbon emissions. So if we're able to do that across the state, we can actually reduce annual forest sector carbon emissions by 14% over the next 50 years for California. Thinking about a state that has a net zero goal in 2045, being able to reduce emissions as much as possible and kind of arrive in a more stable forest carbon state is going to be really, really critical. And just to illustrate a little bit the impact of this innovative wood utilization piece, if you look at the ranks of each of these scenarios here, everything in the 2030s that comes up in orange is capturing and storing less carbon than under business as usual, or sorry, under that climate adjusted business as usual. That's the paying the upfront cost of carbon removal. But then by the time you get into the 2050s, everything you've done is better than taking no action. The CBAU is by far the worst scenario that exists here. So everything that you've done is giving you some benefits. And you can see when we add in the innovative wood utilization in these portfolios here, the rank of each one of them improves quite a bit. So that will illustrate the importance of actually bringing in the wood product side of things as well, not just thinking about the ecosystem side. So a last slide to kind of summarize this all. Since we've done this work across 7 states, we wanted to give you a couple snapshots of states that are very different, but this list of climate smart forestry objectives should look a little similar. There's a lot of stuff in here that Chad mentioned from our work for the Mid-Atlantic. And some of these things like maintaining and increasing forest extent makes sense in all of the states that we've modeled, and the practices that you would actually use to accomplish that goal are pretty similar. You're reducing deforestation, you're planting trees, you might look at silvopasture. In other places, things like protecting and restoring natural regen capabilities in forests is going to be very different. In the Mid-Atlantic, we talked about controlling deer browse or doing some kind of restocking, thinking about reducing diameter limit cuts. In California, you're going to be really focusing on restoring post-fire landscapes and trying to restart the growth process on those lands. Just because there are some blank squares in this matrix, like encouraging sustainable management practices on private lands, that doesn't mean it's not important in the Lake States and the Pacific Coast. It just means it's not something we modeled yet. It might be an opportunity to hear from folks like yourselves who are working on the ground or have an idea of what might be necessary in each state. It's just not something that we modeled, but I think it is, you could argue that it's going to be equally important in every single place that forests are being managed. And then of course, preparing for the impacts of climate change. Again, the impacts of climate change are going to play out differently in each of the regions that we're in, but it's going to be really important for stewarding forests, for creating healthy and resilient forests that are growing and continuing to capture and store as much carbon as they can. So we've been working a lot with our state partners as we finish up all of these projects to plug this into state policy efforts. We're trying to think about other ways that this information can be useful. So we'd certainly be happy to hear from you, either now or after the fact with some of your ideas about how this might be useful, some additional things for us to look at. As I said, this QR code here, if you scan it, will send you straight to the new California report that we released a couple weeks ago. If you go to the link at the bottom to our carbon modeling page, you can find the California report and the Mid-Atlantic reports and publication that Chad mentioned. As we get more work out there published for the Lake States and for Oregon, it will also go there. So there will continue to be some updates from these projects over the next few months. I'll stop there and thank you all for your time and your attention, and we're happy to take any questions now.
That was awesome. It's always impressive to me when a team can go through so much information in a clear way so quickly. So thank you both. That was great. I tried to put a couple of the links in the chat, so hopefully those are there. And I don't think, yeah, so feel free to put questions in the chat window, or you can also, we have few enough people, you can go ahead and unmute and ask questions. And while we're waiting for folks to kind of form their questions, I'll ask one that is probably unfair, but I'm guessing that you have answers because people have asked you in the past. One of the things that comes up in all kinds of work, particularly New Mexico, fire adapted ecosystems all over, is that sort of short-term carbon price that one pays for restoration. And it makes sense to me. It's like, in order to, I don't know, run a long distance, right? You have to pay the price of training in the short term. Maybe not the best example, but one of the things that comes up sometimes is, well, given the climate emergency, carbon, in the next 10 years is super important because of some tipping points, glacier melt or something. So I wonder if either of you have kind of a canned response to, like, how does that, I guess carbon today versus carbon tomorrow is not necessarily the same, right? In some ways, carbon released 100 years from now, we kind of don't really care about because either, the Earth will be so darn hot, no one will be around, or, we'll have fixed the problem. But carbon today really matters. So I don't know if you have a quick response on that.
Yeah, I can take a stab and then Kendall, feel free as well. Yeah, I think there is a strong argument, right, that like mitigation potential sooner is probably more impactful as like an impact on like our climate over time. But I think generally a lot of the ways that people kind of think about this now is thinking about some of these like longer time scales and thinking about kind of like stability and optimizing of different benefits, right? So like again, carbon is just one of many like benefits we get from forest. It is an underlying like function that helps like support all other biological functioning of our systems. But really, it's like one of those things that like if you think about like putting like eggs in a basket or like adding a weight to a scale, it's kind of this mix and match of how do you balance the scale of something like climate mitigation versus some of these other really important benefits that we have. And so like I think generally the easiest way to kind of like maybe punt on answering this is thinking about like forests are very dynamic, right? They're very heterogeneous across space and time, and understanding where are like the win-wins on individual sites versus kind of like these larger scale issues. And so like for example, like as like a proponent of like the health of like working forest lands, that doesn't mean I'm like detracting from conservation or like the preservation of very high biological valued sites or places of high carbon value. And so it's understanding a lot of like what are the very specific like site conditions, and that comes from people on the ground. Like people like me don't know that. And so like working with managers and working with landowners is really where you can help make those decisions, and also understanding what are the management goals of that specific parcel, right? Like what the Forest Service manages federal land for is very different than what somebody manages their back 40 in like the upper Midwest. Some people value recreation, some people value a sense of place, and it's understanding where does kind of carbon and climate fit into that. And really, I think I just come back to a healthy, sustainable forest is probably the best thing for climate overall. Acknowledging that there is time dependencies at some of these activities, right? And like certain actions that you take now can take decades to manifest, right? Like planting a tree today, it's not going to really start sequestering carbon until like 5, 10 years, 20 years down the road. But yeah, that's kind of a way to like think through what are both like the spatial and temporal implications of some of these decisions.
Yeah,
Great.
Chad, I think
Go ahead.
those are all great points. I completely agree that what we need is a mix of a variety of strategies across the landscape that have to respond to the actual conditions on the ground. To your question, Xander, we actually did, for our work in Maryland and Pennsylvania, which hopefully you're seeing this graph for Pennsylvania
Yeah.
right now, we ran a no harvest scenario, which was designed to be extreme, right? This was to say, if we snapped our fingers and all harvesting of all trees in Pennsylvania stopped. We acknowledge this is not a realistic scenario, but it illustrates the kind of the extreme end of what would happen if you did that. So the no harvest scenario is this one here. It's got a lot of big bars, right? So there is a lot more carbon in our model that's accumulated in the ecosystem relative to if harvest were still happening, which makes sense, right? If you're not cutting the trees, if you're not removing them, they are continuing to grow. There's more carbon that accumulates there. However, when you look at the wood product side of things and you think about the whole system together, you'll note that this red net carbon balance dot is actually in positive number territory, which means we are looking at a net carbon source, which means that we're actually emitting more carbon or responsible for more carbon losses than we are for carbon gains from the scenario. And that is entirely driven by the amount of material that would have gone into wood products and now has to be substituted by something else. If you were going to build something with wood, some of it will be built with wood that came from somewhere else. So there's a leakage component. Some of it might be built now with concrete and steel or bricks instead of wood. You have to think about the carbon implications of that entire system. So it's a very extreme example, but this is, results in 2030. This is the first 10 years of our model. We're already seeing that. And we continue to see that. Note that these graphs are on a very different scale, but you continue to see that with this scenario all the way out to the end of the century. So I think as Chad put very well, there are places where this is the appropriate approach. If you have kind of high conservation value areas, you have critical wildlife habitat, protecting those areas can be really, really important, and it can confer carbon benefits, climate mitigation benefits. But as a blanket strategy, none of these things as a blanket strategy is good. Forests have a lot of diversity. We need a diversity of ages and activities and other things across the landscape. So building this into a well-rounded portfolio of actions is really what's going to be most critical.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you both. Mark, I see you came on video. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I work for the Wisconsin County Forest Association, and we have 30 county members that own and manage 2.4 million acres of county forest land. The majority of that land, and so I've listened to the presentation. It's really interesting. Really appreciate the work, and my lens really is, how do you operationalize this at a forest level? And that's what we're called to do as county forests, most of which are certified to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. You have the climate smart forestry principle and performance measures that we need to meet. And the primary way we've done a risk assessment at a forest level is using the toolbox from NIACS and looking at risks for the future and change and so forth. And so, I mean, it's hard to absorb everything that you've presented, but my impression and maybe my question is that it seems like either the recommendations thinking about the lake states fit well within the toolbox that NIACS already has out there. Or maybe are you seeing something from your regional analysis or state level analysis that would be additional to or considerations that as you move forward finalizing these reports, we might look to to consider when we do these assessments of the actions then we can take locally and incorporate in forest practices.
I think great
Haven't you
question
thought
there.
about it at that level? I'm not sure. So it's really, how does this fit within NIAC's toolbox? And I'm not sure if
so
you guys have thought about that. I see they're a partner.
Yeah, so I think pretty much everything we does really fits into kind of like their climate change response framework and like their like resistance, resilience, transformation kind of typology around like a little bit like the adaptation workbook and site specific. So I think there's a couple different things here. So really at this scale, we were thinking a little bit more at like a larger scale of planning and management, right? So our key partners at the state are going to be like state managers, regulators, wood utilization specialists. And so they're thinking about a lot of times like larger landscapes, either directly influencing like state managed land. So right, like Wisconsin DNR is an example, but also like the more passive ways that like a state agency can influence private land management, whether that's through like tax preferential treatment, other types of like kind of qualified forest land programs. So that we do have these kind of like different toolboxes at the regulatory policy level to influence behavior. And I think for me, one of my kind of like important salient takeaways of this entire exercise is working with those state partners who oftentimes are the ones that are kind of defining the exercise that we're doing, right? Like they're the experts in their area. And using that as again as kind of like adding another feather to the cap, to use like an analogy there of like here's just one more resource that they have to inform their decision making. And so a big part of this project is not just the actual like quantified numbers that we're estimating, but a lot of the work we do with our state partners on kind of that knowledge transfer, that science translation of how do you go from quantified like empirical model to using that to inform the Wisconsin DNR talking to the legislature of the state of Wisconsin as they craft new policy that could influence like management and behavior on forest lands. So I would say like not that this doesn't inform very local site specific questions per se, but I would say our results don't get to the level of like telling a specific land manager drawing up a plan for like let's say like a county forest. It doesn't really tell them a whole lot what they should do in that plan because that needs to be informed by like those specific site conditions. And really, I think we're trying to take a little bit more of like a bigger picture around some of like kind of the state level action planning and identifying not just like let's say like one individual forest, but thinking about the health of the entire state's forest. What are the different kind of like tools we have in that toolbox, right? And we're drawing a lot from work NIACS did, like their carbon menu, their adaptation menu workbooks and everything like that, and trying to see if we did this, if let's say we planted an extra 5,000 acres in Wisconsin, where does that move that needle of that potential future climate mitigation benefits, but doesn't say a whole lot of where should we plant those trees, maybe what types of trees are we planting. Are we even thinking about something like taking a seed source from somewhere else that we think is maybe genetically superior for the specific site that we're interested in like restoring? And the answer is no to that, but it still gives us, again, a nice starting point to have some of those conversations and also provide a little bit of like a quantified value to inform that discussion as well.
Great.
Yeah, that I'll just say, that fits even your reflection on California in terms of what's possible because of wood markets or lack of wood markets. It's no different than the lake states. What we can do to a large extent is governed by what markets there are, which unfortunately are declining in terms of and investments. And when you look back, even now we're talking about red pine stands that are all the same age and being harvested. Well, where did those come from? Those came from big public investments in the 50s and 60s to plant those trees. And so, I'm not sure what it'll take to get the attention of policymakers to actually make investments. That'd be great if this research could help with that conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. We'll do one more question if Kendall and Chad have time. Tom asked what the main driver for the Pennsylvania forest turning from carbon sink into a carbon source around 2030. And what does that mean for some states in the Northeast that are looking to their forest to help meet their zero emissions goals?
I was just in the middle of typing
Oh.
up an answer to that one. So no, this is great because you can save my fingers. Yeah, Tom, that's a great question. And it's kind of a complex one to answer. So I'll take a first pass at it, and Chad, if you want to add anything, please do. I think essentially the land use history of Pennsylvania and a lot of states in the Northeast means that there is a large amount of the landscape that is kind of aging at the same rate and getting into a kind of older forest category, which at a stand level means that carbon sequestration rates are slowing down. Individual trees can continue growing and they continue, capturing carbon as they grow. But at a stand level, thinking about decomposition and other dynamics, you're kind of getting to a point where those forests are not capturing as much carbon as younger forests would. It doesn't mean that they're not important across the landscape. And so I think there are some places where making sure that those old trees can continue to grow is going to be really important. But what we found is that there's an imbalance in the age class distribution of forests through Maryland and Pennsylvania, and I think largely through a lot of the Northeast as well, where we just need to kind of even that out a little bit more. If you think of analogize this to a human population, think about what Japan was going through a few years ago, where they had a whole bunch of kind of old people who were about to retire. They didn't have a ton of young people who were growing up and ready to take their place in the economy. And so you can imagine that population is in a little bit of trouble because there's not a balance of ages across the landscape. I think that's pretty fundamental to sustainable forestry, is that you need a good kind of diverse age class distribution. And so I think that's kind of the driver for Pennsylvania, is that there's a lot of the landscape that's aging at the same time. If states can take actions to kind of even that out a little bit and protect some of those areas that need to be protected, let some of those old trees continue to grow, but also, Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry has a lot of objectives for wildlife habitat, which is often kind of younger sterile stage forests. If you can just start meeting those multiple objectives, that will kind of restart the carbon engine in a little bit, in a way. And that's part of what we were able to demonstrate with that portfolio scenario, is that if you actually take some steps to try to even out or kind of diversify that age class distribution, it ends up with a much better trajectory into the future.
I think we'll stop there. That was a great answer. And that's sort of what I want to hold in my head as I'm finishing up my day here. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate the time you put into, well, first the work. It's really important research for the nation, but then also just today, like getting a clear presentation, good graphics, etc. I know that takes time, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to come and speak.
Anytime.
I think I speak for both Chad and I when I say we'd be happy to continue fielding questions or talking about this. So I'm going to put our emails into the chat. They were also in, the last slide of our presentation, and we can share that, but really happy to continue the conversation and, learn from all of you and share more information as we can.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We'll share the recording and hope to see you on another webinar, or actually even better in person, maybe out in the woods.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Sander.
Thank you. Bye.